Let's go to Psalm 145 this evening in the Scriptures. Psalm 145. Psalm 145. This is a Psalm of David, also known as a praise of David. It's a very interesting psalm. The Talmud tells us that God blesses those who read it 3 times a day. So oftentimes the Jews will read it 3 times in the morning and 1 time in the evening. We're not going to read it 3 times together this evening. We'll read through it once. But again, a very interesting psalm. Psalm 145 starts in verse 1. I will extol thee, my God, O King, and I will bless thy name forever and ever. Every day will I bless thee, and I will praise thy name forever and ever. Great is the Lord, and greatly to be praised, and his greatness is unsearchable. One generation shall praise thy works to another, and shall declare thy mighty acts. I will speak of the glorious honor of thy majesty, and of thy wondrous works. And men shall speak of the might of thy terrible acts, and I will declare thy greatness. They shall abundantly utter the memory of thy great goodness, and shall sing of thy righteousness. The Lord is gracious and full of compassion, slow to anger and of great mercy. The Lord is good to all, and his tender mercies are over all his works. All thy works shall praise thee, O Lord, and thy saints shall bless thee. They shall speak of the glory of thy kingdom and talk of thy power, to make known to the sons of men his mighty acts and the glorious majesty of his kingdom. Thy kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and thy dominion endureth throughout all generations. The Lord upholdeth all that fall, and raiseth up all those that be bowed down. The eyes of all wait upon thee, and thou givest them their meat in due season. Thou openest thine hand, and satisfiest the desire of every living thing. The Lord is righteous in all his ways, and holy in all his works. The Lord is nigh unto all them that call upon him, to all that call upon him in truth. He will fulfill the desire of them that fear him. He will also hear their cry and will save them. The Lord preserveth all them that love him, but all the wicked will he destroy. My mouth shall speak the praise of the Lord, and let all flesh bless his holy name forever and ever. You may be seated. As we look at this psalm this evening, let's look at this psalm to see what it says to us about God. And the first thing that I would like to see as to what this psalm says concerning God is about God's greatness. We read in verse 3, great is the Lord and greatly to be praised, and his greatness is unsearchable. We read in verse 5, I will speak of the glorious honor of thy majesty and of thy wondrous works. And again we read in verse 6, and men shall speak of the might of thy terrible acts, and I will declare thy greatness. In fact, God's greatness is beyond our ability to fathom. It is impossible for us to fully understand it. But as we get into the Scriptures can give us an inclination to that greatness. You know, the Jewish nation, as they gathered around Mount Sinai and they saw the presence of God come down on Mount Sinai, they said, behold, the Lord our God has showed us his glory and his greatness. The prophet Isaiah in Isaiah chapter 6 saw God for who he really was. And he then exclaimed in chapter 40, all nations before him are as nothing, and they are counted to him less than nothing in vanity. And the prophet then asks these 2 questions, to whom then will ye liken God? Or what likeness will ye compare unto him? You know, we live in a world that mocks God. We live in a world that thinks that it can define for us who God is and how he ought to be, and then reprimand God when he doesn't rise to their definition. But the greatness of God is far beyond what any man can comprehend. What human being can satisfactorily define God and his greatness? You know, it's certainly due to God's unimaginable greatness that he forbade the making of graven images. These images could never have demonstrated God's greatness and would have had a diminishing effect on the Jews' ability to understand God's greatness. As we go through the Scriptures, we see God's attributes that again attest to his greatness. God is infinite. God is immutable. God is self-sufficient. God is omniscient. God is omnipresent. God is wise and is faithful. God is good and gracious. God is loving. In all reality this evening, I think it would be impossible for us at any time to overestimate the greatness of God. So first of all, this evening, God's greatness. Secondly, let's consider God's power. Again, in our text, Psalm 145, we already read verse 6, and men shall speak of the might of thy terrible acts, and I will declare thy greatness. Go to verse 11 again. They shall speak of the glory of thy kingdom and talk of thy power, to make known to the sons of men his mighty acts and the glorious majesty of his kingdom. Thy kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and thy dominion endureth throughout all generations. God's power. Now, I think oftentimes when we think of God's power, we think of the creation. We think of the universe. And we see such power in the creation of the universe. As well, we see such power in the sustaining of that creation. As even the atom is unstable in its tendency, yet God holds all things together perfectly so that they continue precisely in the manner that he wants them to. God's power. You know, we read in Colossians 1, and speaking of Jesus Christ, for by him were all things created that are in heaven and that are in earth, visible and invisible, whether they be thrones or dominions or principalities or powers. All things were created by him and for him, and he is above all things, and by him all things consist. When I went off to Bible college, the Bible college where I went offered flight. And I was going in as a missions major, and I knew there were missionaries around the world that used aviation, and so I went ahead and got involved in that flight program. And I'll never forget my first flight. As an 18-year-old. Pedaled my bicycle out to the nearby airport, met my instructor, former Navy pilot, took me out to the airplane, and I don't think that airplane was any wider than this pulpit. It was small, little Piper Tomahawk, little two-seater. He talked me through the inspection. He talked me through starting it up, taxiing it. From the right seat, he handled the takeoff and the climb out, and he got it to altitude, and he leveled the thing off. And once the plane was nice and level, he looked at me and he said, "Okay, Bob, you have the airplane." And so I grabbed the yoke. And it was at that point in time that level flight ceased. I'm telling you, I think I went through every square inch of airspace over that city. I could not hold that plane level. It was a hot Florida day, a lot of thermals coming up from the ground, a lot of wind coming in off the Gulf, and we were all over the place. And finally, after about 20 minutes of that, he took it back, and we went back to the airport, and I thought, I will never be able to pilot an aircraft. But I stuck with it. And with time, I could take the plane off. I could get it off the runway. I could climb out. I could get to altitude. I could level off. And without having to think, I could simply hold the yoke with my left hand, leaving my right hand free to do whatever I needed to. I could talk with my instructor. I could look at a sectional map. All that without losing level flight. Kind of like second nature. Well, that is precisely the way that God sustains this universe. You know, he's not preoccupied by it. In his power, he simply sustains that which he has created perfectly and without failure. You know, NASA tells us that during a single second, the sun converts 400 million tons of matter into pure energy, which is equal to about 90 billion megatons per second. That sounds really big. But we need a comparison. Okay, well, the power generating capacity of the earth equals about 60,000 megatons per year. So in 1 second, the sun produces over 1 million years worth of energy for the earth in 1 second. And you can fit 1,300,000 Earths within the sphere of the sun. And that's one star in the universe. Amongst how many? Well, I'm glad you asked. David Cornwright, an astronomer at Ithaca College in New York, attempted to calculate the number of stars. If you can possibly imagine, Good luck with that, buddy. He used a very rough estimate of 10 trillion galaxies in the universe, multiplying that by the Milky Way's estimated 100 billion stars. He came up with a real big number, one with 24 zeros after it. That was his estimation as to the number of stars. Yet Kornreich emphasized that number is likely a gross underestimation, as a more detailed look at the universe shows even more galaxies. God's power, as seen in creation. God's power is seen in the Old Testament miracles, the flood, the 10 plagues on Egypt, the parting of the Red Sea, the deaths of Korah and his friends, the walls of Jericho, the sun and the moon standing still, Gideon's army, Elijah on Mount Carmel, Jonah released from the great fish, the sundial turned back 10 degrees, the 3 Jews in the fiery furnace. Is it any wonder at all that the nation of Israel exclaimed, O Lord God, thou hast begun to show thy servant thy greatness and thy mighty hand, for what God is there in heaven or on earth that can do according to thy works and according to thy might? And even the Apostle Paul says in Ephesians 1:19, and what is the exceeding greatness of his power to usward who believe, according to the working of his mighty power. God's power is limitless, and it is unmatched. So we've seen God's greatness in the psalm this evening. We've seen his power. Let's now look at God's holiness. Again, back to Psalm 145, verse 7. They shall abundantly utter the memory of thy great goodness and shall sing of thy righteousness. Verse 17, the Lord is righteous in all his ways and holy in all his works. Verse 20, the Lord preserveth all them that love him, but all the wicked will he destroy. The attribute of God's holiness is the one that best describes him. It is, in fact, the total of his attributes, and it's what brings together all of God's attributes. God's holiness refers to his separateness or his otherness, being above any other being that exists. God's holiness demonstrates his complete and utter perfection. It refers to the sheer godness of God himself. God's holiness is not an aspect of who he is or what he does. God's holiness is the essence of who he is. And everything that God thinks, desires, speaks, and does is done perfectly holy in every way. The word holy pertaining to God or to something that he has sanctified is seen 611 times in 544 verses of the Scriptures. It's found in 51 of the 66 books of the canon. So is it any wonder, again, that the nation of Israel exclaimed, who is like unto thee, O Lord, among the gods? Who is like thee, glorious in holiness, fearful in praises, doing wonders? Or is it surprising that we would read in 1 Samuel 2:2, there is none holy as the Lord, for there is none beside thee, neither is there any rock like our God. Right. Now, oftentimes when we think of God's holiness, that causes pause. I mean, if we talk about God's greatness, we like that. Let's go. Or if we talk about God's power, we like that too. We serve a powerful God. But when we speak of God's holiness, sometimes we're a little disquieted by that because we see ourselves for who we are. And we recognize our sinfulness. And so maybe sometimes when we think of God's holiness, that scares us, as it were, or concerns us. But recognize with me this evening that God's holiness is, in fact, our protection. Think about what Tozer says. Since God's first concern for his universe is its moral health, that is, its holiness, whatever is contrary to this is necessarily under his eternal displeasure. To preserve his creation, God must destroy whatever would destroy it. When he arises to put down iniquity and save the world from irreparable moral collapse, he is said to be angry. Yet every wrathful judgment in the history of the world has been a holy act of preservation on the part of God. The holiness of God, the wrath of God, and the health of the creation are inseparably united. It is God's holiness that brings us back when we deviate from what he wants us to be, or when we deviate from what he wants us to do. It is, in fact, our protection. And it is only this attribute that is repeated 3 times successively as seen in Isaiah chapter 6 and Revelation chapter 4. Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty. You know, when we first started the church in Baingerville, I found very quickly that I had weekly and sometimes daily contact with Muslims. And that was new to me. I grew up on the west side of Cleveland, Ohio in the 70s, going into the 80s, and I had never met a Muslim there at that point in time. I'm sure I would today if I were there now. But I hadn't up until that point in time, and so I get off to the Ivory Coast, and now here I am. I find myself working with them quite a bit. It was a Muslim that rented us chairs for our church. It was a Muslim that rented us tents for our children's ministry. My landscaper was a Muslim. My welder was a Muslim. You know, just all kinds of different people I'm meeting and I'm using. And I want to give them the gospel, but it's challenging because when you're the client or you're the boss, it's not really a level playing field. So I try to think, what can I do to level the playing field so that I can begin to give the gospel to these guys? And I just started inviting them over for lunch every Tuesday. I said, you guys come to lunch. We'll eat together. It'll start at noon, and we're going to quit at 1:30. I'm sorry, I'll be a little bit American about this. At 1:30, we're done because I'll have things to do. But you come, and we'll eat from noon to 1:30. And so they started coming. And I knew with time, they're going to start talking. Because there's like 7 or 8 of them. There's only one of me. And we're just sitting around eating and talking, you know. And I began to learn their concept of Christianity was very, very Catholic. You know, one day they were talking, they said, you know, you Christians, we really don't like this about you Christians. And I said, well, I don't like that either. You don't like that? No, I don't like that either. Yeah, I'm a Christian, but I don't like that either. Really? Yeah, oh, okay. And then, you know, a little while later, you know, we just don't understand why you Christians do this. Well, I don't do that. You don't do that? No. Yeah, I'm a Christian, but no, I don't do that. Really, yeah. Finally, one of them looked at his friends and said, hey, guys, maybe we're Baptist Muslims, you know. And I said, now, hang on a minute. I said, we can't make that jump just yet. Let's keep talking. We'll see what we can do. And I told him, I said, you guys ask a question. I'll tell you everything the Bible says about it. You tell me everything that the Quran says about it. So they said, fine. And we went through a number of questions, and we finally got to the one I wanted to get to. What does somebody have to do to spend eternity with God? There we are. So I get up on the first Tuesday, and I'm talking with them about sin, and I asked them, I said, tell me, does the Quran forbid stealing? He said, yes, it does. I said, but we have thieves in this world. Yes, we do. I said, well, why is that? And I'm expecting an answer like, because man of his own will and his own volition decides to do that which is contrary to God's law and God's commandments. But you know, that's not what I heard. When I asked them, why do they have thieves? They said, because God creates them that way. Yeah. I mean, before I could even get a hold of myself, I said, well, man, what kind of a God is that? And they looked at me and they said, well, who are you to judge God? I said, no, you're not getting it. This is not a judgment on my part. I'm holding in my hands the Word of God, and in this Word, God describes Himself to us. And the God that is described in this book is holy, and it is impossible that out of this side of His mouth He forbids stealing, and then out of this side of His mouth He creates men to do just that. God is holy. He is just. He is righteous. Lastly, in considering God this evening, let's look at God's mercy. Look at verse 8. The Lord is gracious and full of compassion, slow to anger and of great mercy. Verse 9, the Lord is good to all, and His tender mercies are all over His works. Verse 14, the Lord upholdeth all that fall, and raiseth up all those that are bowed down, that be bowed down. Verse 15, the eyes of all wait upon thee, and thou givest them their meat in due season. Verse 16, thou openest thine hand and satisfies the desires of every living thing. Verse 18, the Lord is nigh unto all them that call upon him, to all that call upon him in truth. And verse 19, he will fulfill the desire of them that fear him. He will also hear their cry and save them. You know, when we think about God's greatness and God's power and God's holiness, it seems preposterous that he would save us. But in his mercy, he does. And when we think of that greatness and power and holiness, it seems preposterous that he would continue to work with us throughout our Christian life. But again, that is precisely what he does. God's mercies accompany us every day of our Christian life. You know, in 2008, as we showed in the video, there was an older man in our church, Kalibali Sapane. His father passed away up in their village in the far north of the country. He went up to help arrange the funeral. It was going to be a 5-day funeral. And when he came back from that, he found me. He said, Pastor, I was able to arrange for 2 hours of prayer and preaching at my dad's funeral. I said, no way, because I knew the gospel had never been officially preached in this village. Many of the villagers had heard the gospel elsewhere, but it had never been preached officially in this village. I said, how'd you do that? He said, well, it wasn't easy. He said, they looked at me and they said, your dad wasn't a Christian. Why would we have 2 hours of prayer and preaching his funeral? He said, I told him, yes, to my knowledge, my dad never converted to Christ. But when I did, I came up here and I told him about my decision and he blessed it. And I'm his oldest son and I'm saying I want 2 hours of prayer and preaching. I said, so they gave it to you? He said, no, not yet, they didn't. I said, well, then what did you say? He said, Pastor, I told them that if they would allow for 2 hours in prayer and preaching, I would see to it that there was a very special preacher there to do the preaching. Now, normally for a missionary, you can't get a bigger, wider, longer red carpet kicked down that center aisle. I mean, are you kidding me? Go preach the gospel in a village where it hasn't been preached? Let's go! Except, at that point in time in the Ivory Coast, only the southern half of the country was under government control. The entire northern half of the country was under the control of a baseless rebel army. And it's not that Zana Pleidugu was in the rebel territory, it's that we had to go all the way through the rebel territory to get it, right on the border with Burkina Faso. And I said, Cleveland, I'm sorry, but that's just not possible. Okay? Good grief. I go gallivanting around up there in the rebel territory. The U.S. Embassy is going to scream at me. Probably a lot of my supporting churches are going to scream at me. And listen, we've got a lot of national pastors that are very special preachers that are a whole lot less conspicuous than what I'm going to be up there. So why don't we see about one of them going? And he said, well, Pastor, I understand what you're saying, but there are some Western missionaries that have returned up there. And he says, I really think this is the best opportunity for my village. And I got angry. You can't tighten the screws on me like this to go up there. I'm not going up there. But I did what we all do when we want to be spiritual. You know what I told him. I said, I'll tell you what, Cleveland, I will pray about it. Right, exactly. And even as I'm saying that, in my mind, slam dunk, no. But I guess for integrity's sake, I did pray about it. And God truly disquieted me. Made me very uncomfortable. To the extent that by the time I got to the end of the week, it was impossible to think that I wasn't going. So we went. And we got through the rebel territory. Some interesting stories involved, but we got through it. We got up to the village. They greeted us so warmly. We got off on the first night to preach. The funeral was starting on a Thursday night, and we're the first 2 hours of it. And we rented a generator and a sound system, and we had 300 chairs set up. And all those 300 chairs are full. The chief's right on the front row. All the notables of the village are there. And if that's 300 that are seated looking at everyone that's standing around us, there's probably about 800 people there. For 2 hours, we preached the gospel. I came back to the microphone afterwards wondering what in the world I was going to do. You know, where we were there's no just as I am. There's no softly and tenderly Jesus is calling. It's just me looking at them. And I said, you've heard for the last 2 hours that you were born at enmity with God, but that through the intermediary work of Jesus Christ, you can be reconciled to God. So if you want to be reconciled to God tonight through the intermediary work of Jesus Christ, you come forward, we'll continue to talk with you, and everyone else can go. And 9 people came. So we started working with them. And Kalibli went and talked to the chief. He came back to me, he says, Pastor, we're doing this again tomorrow night. I said, okay, we're here, let's do it. The next night again, Friday night, we're up there, we preach again for 2 hours. I give the same kind of invitation. 51 people come. And we're working with them very carefully, very, very carefully. But as Kalibli took them off, I started closing down the service, and I looked to the spokesman of the chief, and I said, please tell the chief how much we appreciate the welcome that he gave us here. I have never been welcomed in an African village better than I've been welcomed here. And he's allowed us to preach not once, but 2 times. Please thank him for us, and please see if it's okay with him if we leave very early tomorrow morning. So the spokesman says that to the chief in the chairman language. The chief responds to the spokesman in the chairman language, and finally the spokesman looks at me and he says, Pastor, the chief says, yes, you can leave tomorrow morning. But the chief wants to bring to your attention that you now have 60 converts in this village. And the chief thinks that you should know that we have no church in this village. Therefore, we have nobody in this village who's qualified to take care of your 60 converts. So the chief is asking you to send a missionary or a pastor here to be a spiritual leader to your 60 converts. Pastor, the chief says that this village is going to give you a piece of land. He's asking you to put a church building on it as a spiritual home for your 60 converts. Here is an Islamic animist African chief explaining for me rather biblically what my responsibility is to those 60 converts. And by God's grace, we did this. And I'm going to tell you, in my life in missions, 30 years on the mission field, I've never had an experience like that one. You say, well, why are you telling the story? I'll tell you why. It's because it was only by God's grace and God's mercy that I was even there. Because I told God, I'm not going. That doesn't make sense. It's a stupid idea. And God could have said, fine, take a seat. I'll send somebody else up there. And then I never would have seen it. I never would have saw the power of God in that circumstance. I never would have seen how God can start a church even if the missionary didn't realize that was coming. I wouldn't have had the experience. I just would have heard about it and spend the rest of my life regretting it. But God, in his mercy, disquieted me and made me uncomfortable and slammed me down in the front seat of that vehicle and told me to get on up there. God's mercy. So we see God's greatness, we see God's power, we see God's holiness, and we see God's mercy. In a very quick conclusion this evening, what should that provoke from us? Look again at verse 1 and 2. I will extol thee, my God, O King, and I will bless thy name forever and ever. Every day will I bless thee. I will praise thy name forever and ever. Look at verse 4. One generation shall praise thy works to another and shall declare thy mighty acts. Look at verse 10. All thy works shall praise thee, O Lord, and thy saints shall bless thee. They shall speak of the glory of thy kingdom and talk of thy power to make known to the sons of men his mighty acts and the glorious majesty of his kingdom. Verse 21, my mouth shall speak the praise of the Lord, and let all flesh bless his holy name forever and ever. When we see God's greatness and his power and his holiness and his mercy, how can we just sit on that knowledge? How can we just be content in knowing those things? When we see God for who he is, it must provoke us to proclaim his name and declare his acts. You're endeavoring to do that here in San Leandro. I heard about the activities that you have coming up, and those activities are expressly to give the gospel to the lost. As well, you have your missions program. You are praying for missionaries. I see them on your list. You're supporting those missionaries financially. You are absolutely involved in proclaiming the name of God and in declaring his works. And earlier we celebrated that because we see what God has done up until this point. But as human beings, we must be continually prodded. We're sinful. We tend to back off. And we must be continually prodded to realize, no, I must increase in proclaiming God. I must increase in declaring the mighty acts that he has done, especially to those who have never heard. God's greatness, God's power, God's holiness, God's mercy. Let's proclaim these things around the world.